the first part of this presentation, we have examined different models or frameworks to look at the quality of education. In the second part, we will now go over a series of indicators that can be used to assess quality. And these indicators belong precisely to the four domains, the four areas that we have identified: inputs, process, results or outputs, and outcomes. We will not, in this case, examine the context, which is a different part of the analysis. As we will see, the indicators are relatively evident for inputs and for results. We will explain why. To a large extent because these are measurable elements. They are quite more difficult to identify in some cases, or to construct, or to calculate for the domains that we have called processes and outcomes. What we will do in the next slides is go systematically over each of these different domains. Let us start with indicators on inputs, and let me start with asking you a question. What do you consider the essential inputs into an education system? What do you consider the elements that a ministry, a government have to provide to teachers, to schools, to the district offices maybe, in order to make sure that quality education, quality schooling, quality learning can be achieved? Again, reflect on this for a few moments. You can pause the presentation, write down what are some 2, 3, 4 essential inputs into an education system according to you. There are undoubtedly a wide range of inputs that may be needed, and I have listed a few, but you probably have thought of some others. A first set of inputs would be called facilities, issues such as classrooms, evidently. In many countries, it will be considered that every school needs a library. Especially at secondary level, we may need laboratories. We may think of workrooms, workshops in technical and vocational education institutions. A playground is important in order for the school to be welcoming. Latrines are an evident need. We may then think also of equipment. Equipment can go from the very basic, which would be a table and a table for a teacher, a desk for every student, a blackboard in a room. Equipment is also, of course, things such as functioning electricity, running water. Equipment may go into much more, including maybe a computer in each classroom, a video projector in some classrooms, and so on. Textbooks and teacher guides are essential inputs, and many others may have referred to instructional materials such as computers or tablets, whichever you may consider to be the most pertinent materials. You may have looked at others because indeed the choice of these inputs depends quite a bit on your own context. Now, the indicators that we will develop to assess the quality of inputs will look both at the availability and at the quality. And these indicators, they will allow us to answer a wide range of questions. I just list a few here. How many pupils or students possess the main textbooks could be a question that we want to address. How many teachers possess teachers' guides or the teaching material? In what state are the school buildings, the basic infrastructure? Do all schools have internet connections? Are there sufficient latrines and toilets? How many classrooms are equipped according to the norms? This would suppose that a country has defined a norm for classroom equipment. How many students have access to a school library? How many students have access to other learning facilities, and so on? And the indicators to respond to these different questions are quite self-evident to a large extent because we each time are in this case talking about items that are visible and easily countable, easily measurable. And we could imagine an indicator such as the textbook pupil ratio. How many textbooks does each pupil have? Or we could indicator that is different but on a similar topic, the share of pupils or students who have the required set of textbooks. We could, in the same vein, define the share of teachers with the required set of teachers' guides. We may look at percentage of schools with functioning internet connection, or, which is a bit different, the percentage of students in schools with functioning internet connection. Because indeed, if, for instance, we are in a system where there are many small schools that have internet connection, but some of the bigger schools do not, obviously, we will have a difference here between these indicators. We may look at students' latrine ratio for boys and for girls separately, quite evidently. And quite a few systems will have norms on this. They will maybe, for instance, say that for every 35, 40, 45, 50 pupils, you need at least one latrine. Pupil classroom ratios are a popular indicator because they allow us to see, to some extent, to appreciate the comfort of a student and a pupil in the classroom. We do not want classrooms to be overcrowded. Other indicators that are similar would be, for instance, the square feet, the amount of square feet per pupil in the school, which is similar in as pupil classroom ratio, but a bit more precise maybe. Now, the relevance of these indicators, of course, depends very much on a country's context and on its policies. If we are in a country where, to a large extent, we know that all schools have the basic facilities, we know they all have electricity, running water, the necessary tables and desks in good conditions, then we may consider that we do not necessarily need to collect these data and analyze these indicators, because we know to a large extent that everybody, every school is in a good situation. If we are in a different environment, we may still want to focus on this. At the same time, policies can be an important factor to take into account. If we have declared as a policy that all students must have access to internet, and that all students, for instance, have the right to a tablet, as some countries have done, then it is important to look at that particular input and that particular indicator. At the same time, it always remains important to examine also the possible disparities within a country. Because as we already said when we were discussing the characteristics of an effective sector plan, the analysis needs to pay attention to the disparities, because the plan also needs to pay attention to the disparities. It is possible that there are significant disparities between different types of schools, between different districts, and that the situation is quite different for particular groups, for instance, for students with special needs. So even if the indicators of inputs are relatively straightforward, and even if we may consider that some key inputs are now available to everybody, it is still useful to examine some of these to see if there are significant disparities between schools. Now, one input that I may have thought that I have forgotten or that I did not yet mention, and that you may consider to be the most valuable input to any education system, is the teacher. I didn't forget the teachers. They are indeed the most essential, the most valuable input. I didn't mention them because they deserve some separate examination. They deserve probably a separate analysis. They are a form of input in the sense that they are provided by the Ministry of Education, or sometimes by parental organizations or special or private providers. In any case, they are provided to the education system and to the schools, but obviously teachers are quite different in nature from textbooks, from computers, simply because they are human actors. And here again a question to you: when you would need to analyze the teaching force within an education sector analysis. What are some of the key questions that you feel an analysis of the teaching force should address? Here again, I give you some time to reflect on this. Think a bit, what are some of the key characteristics of teachers that you think an analysis should address, should cover? What are some of the major questions that you yourself may have about the teaching force? You could pause the presentation here for a moment and think about that question. So what are the key questions that an analysis of the teaching force should address? Here again, there may be quite a lot of different questions. I've listed 4 that come up regularly. One, of course, is, are there actually sufficient teachers? Do we have enough teachers in our system? That may be a particular problem with some subjects. Indeed, we know in quite a few countries that it is always difficult to find teachers in some of the science subjects, in some of the mathematics subjects, for instance. Second question, what is the profile of the teaching force? Profile in terms of age, in terms of experience, in terms of sex. Are there more male or more female teachers? Increasingly, and this is certainly very much the case in the OECS, the teaching force has become a female teaching force for a range of reasons, but this may have its implications, including on enrollment, survival, and the quality of the learning experience by boys. What are the qualifications and what is the training that teachers have benefited from? Both the pre-service and the in-service training, and how well supported are teachers? Supported maybe by other teachers, supported by the principal, supported by curriculum officers, pedagogical advisors. How well are they supervised? Here again, it probably is useful to develop some sort of framework to analyze teacher effectiveness. And what I have tried to do in the next slide is to organize the different factors that may have an impact on teacher effectiveness, on teacher quality, and group them around 2 main issues, as you can see here. The argument here is that an effective teacher is a teacher who is well motivated and who has the necessary competencies in terms of subject matter and in terms of pedagogical methods. And these 2 key characteristics are influenced by 6 different areas, 6 different domains that need to be analyzed as part of an analysis of the teaching force. One of these areas are the qualifications that teachers benefit from that has an impact on their competencies. A second is the training, both the pre-service or the initial training and the ongoing training, which is part of their professional development. These 2 domains, qualifications and training, have mainly an impact on competency. Arguably, some of the training may also have an impact on their motivation, but still it's mainly an impact on their competencies. And so some of the questions we will ask relate precisely to qualifications and initial and ongoing training. The motivation of teachers is impacted upon by their incentives. Incentives would include salaries, but maybe also other benefits, maybe also non-monetary rewards they may receive, and their working conditions. And then there are 2 areas that have an impact both on their competencies and their motivation. The supervision and the support they receive is one way in which they will be increasing their competency, but also be kept motivated, and the overall management of the teaching force, the way in which they are recruited, the way in which they are deployed, the way in which they are evaluated, and so on, has an impact on their competencies and on their motivation. So these different elements allow us to examine the teaching force in a broad manner. And some of these elements are quite straightforward, others less. The elements that are quite straightforward to analyze are, of course, the numbers of teachers. And indeed, one indicator that tends to be very popular is what is called the pupil-teacher ratio. The training and the qualifications of teachers, where we could imagine the percentage of teachers with required teacher training, with required qualifications. Their working conditions can be examined. Other areas, supervision, support, management, are a bit more complicated. And one exercise that we will want you to do, and that we will post on the platform a little later, is precisely to reflect a bit more on what are some of the indicators that you could develop for each of these groups of factors that have an impact on teacher effectiveness. That summarizes some of the elements that we need to look at when we examine the inputs into the education system. Let us now examine the second domain in our overall framework on the quality of education, namely the process. Let me start by recalling when we talk about the process, what we actually refer to. Well, the term process refers to a diversity of relationships, of processes. And we can make a distinction between four of them. First of all, we look in the classroom itself at the teaching learning process and the ways also in which teachers evaluate learners. That in itself is a key element of that term process. We also should look in the school at the relationships between teachers and students, between the principal and the teachers, and among the teachers. We know that these are also processes that are important. We make a distinction also, or we can highlight the process, the relationship between the school and the community. And that can, for instance, be about the existence and the functioning of school management committees, the support that the school receives from the surrounding community, the relationships with the parents, the regularity of meeting with the parents, the support that parents provide to the school, and so on. And then a very key element in that process is then the relationship between the school and the administration, and in particular, these officers within the administration who regularly visit the school, and therefore we will look at the prevalence and the quality of school supervision, teacher supervision, school support, teacher support. This can be a description more than a definition of what we would call process. I recall that the whole idea is that we argue that the inputs that are provided into the education system will be transformed into results through this process, through the way in which teachers teach, principals manage their schools, supervisors, education officers, curriculum officers, early childhood education officers provide support to the teachers and the schools and supervise them, the ways in which also the overall education system is managed by the chief education officers and so on. These are the process factors. And you can hear already that the factors that we refer to here, they are much more difficult to pinpoint and much more difficult to number. Indeed, the analysis of the process is actually faced with at least two problems. First of all, it is rare that on these different elements, we will have somewhere a set of data that is immediately available to those of us who want to do an analysis. We usually have somewhere a system, we tend to call it the education management information system, which will tell us how many teachers we have in the system, their qualifications, their training. We will not have in that same system something that will tell us how good that teacher teaches. We may have something about the number of principals, quite evidently. We may have even something about the number of school management committees, but we will not have information on how good that principal manages the school or what type of support the school management committee gives. That information does exist in many cases, but it is written in reports such as supervision reports, reports that the school makes, and minutes of meetings and so on. But it is very rare that these reports are systematically collected or that they are prepared in such a way that they can easily be analyzed. Secondly, even if this were the case, it is many of the judgments we are making about processes are very subjective judgments. They are complex issues. Responding to the question, is the school well managed? That depends very much on, of course, our personal judgment of what is good management. And it also depends very much on what indeed we have as information on that school management practice. And these judgments therefore can be very different between the different judges. And as a result, it becomes almost impossible to compare between schools or even between teachers. It is rare that these assessments about teacher quality in sense of teacher pedagogical interventions, about school management, about even the support that the administration gives to schools, about the quality of a supervision visit by an education officer, these judgments are usually not standardized. And so it is very difficult to compare over time or compare between teacher schools or districts. So the analysis of the process is always very difficult, and in many cases, our analysis of quality will, precisely for that reason, not pay much attention to the issues of process, while they are actually arguably more important than the input factor. What can be done? Well, I see three possible ways of collecting the necessary information. The first one is, and a number of countries have done that, and it would be interesting to discuss a bit among yourselves if that has been done also in some OECS countries, that reports in particular, for instance, reports by education officers, school supervisors, are given a template which obliges the report authors to provide information that can be analyzed, whereby indeed the same information will be present in each report and will be present in such a manner that it can be analyzed, where, for instance, indeed the assessment of a school principal's management of the school will be on a scale from 1 to 5 with a detailed description of what 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 imply. Even then, there is still some subjectivity to that judgment, but there is some form of standardization, and that does make, of course, the analysis of these reports much more useful, much more feasible and much more useful. A second possibility, again, a number of systems are increasingly doing that, is to administer opinion surveys among, for instance, students, among parents, among teachers, even among principals or district officers, whereby maybe every year or every 2 or 3 years, a sample of teachers, or at times the whole group of teachers, are being given a small survey, for instance, on how have you experienced the way in which the principal manages the school, the way in which the district education officer supports your school, the way in which the ministry communicates with your school, to get an overview of how the overall process of managing the education system and how these different processes that we were referring to, the interactions within the school, the interaction between the school and the administration, how these different processes are appreciated by key actors. Third possible way of collecting the necessary information is, of course, doing research, actual research, or analyzing existing research reports. And these are three complementary ways of doing an analysis of the process. With that, we have looked at issues of process. As you see, it is more difficult here to identify clear indicators than when we did so for the issue of inputs. Let's now look at the indicators of results. With results, remember, we mean to a large extent the ways in which students master the curriculum. And indeed, the main result that an education system will want to achieve is that all students master the curriculum. And the main question that an education sector analysis needs to answer is then, how many students have acquired what knowledge and skills in the core subjects of the curriculum? And several indicators can respond to this question for various levels of education and for various subjects. We can imagine that we will have a specific indicator if we consider basic literacy at grade 3 to be important. One indicator that at the moment is gaining quite some popularity because it is being promoted by the World Bank, which remains a very important actor in education, both as a financing agency and as a technical agency that provides advice. An agency that undoubtedly has been criticized for many different reasons, justifyingly so or sometimes less so. At the moment, the World Bank is focusing much on what they call a learning poverty indicator, and I give a brief description here taken from a World Bank publication of what that actually means. Learning poverty means being unable to read and understand the simple text by age 10. This indicator, therefore, brings together schooling and learning indicators. It begins with the share of children who haven't achieved minimum reading proficiency as measured in schools. And it is adjusted, it takes into account the proportion of children who are out of school and therefore are assumed not to be able to read proficiently. So learning poverty really refers to all of the 10-year-old children who cannot read with proficiency, either because they have not learned sufficiently in school or because they are no longer in school. In the OECS countries, almost all, if not all, 10-year-old children are in school, and therefore the learning poverty indicator will refer more or mainly, uniquely to those children who have not achieved minimum reading proficiency in school. The information to calculate indicators of results really comes from two main sources. Firstly, examinations, and secondly, achievement tests. There is a long discussion on the value of examinations, the value of achievement tests, the need for more and more achievement tests because examinations are not always providing correct information. It is a long debate. At the moment, achievement tests are very popular, probably, I would believe, more popular than they actually should be. I will explain in a moment what I mean with that. It is true that there has been much criticism on examinations as a tool to measure quality of learning for several reasons, three in particular. Firstly, it is considered that in many countries, examinations do not have sufficient reliability, in the sense that you may have the same exam paper being corrected by different people and you will come up with different results. It is not a reliable instrument to measure quality, because you have these multiple correctors and sometimes even over time different marking schemes, and that is partly at times because examinations are not only an instrument to measure quality, but they are also a selection instrument for future opportunity in schooling. An end of secondary school exam will decide if you can continue into university. An end of primary school exam, which tends not to exist anymore in many countries, used to be a way of seeing if you had access to secondary. And in many cases, the examination measurement was influenced as much by the opportunities for progress and the places available in the next cycle as by the actual result of the student. So that is one major criticism that has been addressed to examinations, that they are not fully reliable. Secondly, it has also been argued that at times they are simply not very well constructed, and therefore their validity is limited. They do not represent properly the curriculum that you expect students to master. As a result, the argument is made that it is very difficult to compare, especially over time, examination results. Especially if you would look at the pass mark, or indeed the share of students who go through to the next year. In many cases, that does not really inform you about their results as much as it informs you about opportunities in the next cycle. Even if these opportunities in the next cycle remain the same, because the correctors are different from year to year and the marking schemes may be different, and the content of the examination and the level of difficulty of the examination is not the same from one year to the next, it is not the best measurement of quality or the evolution of quality. And therefore, indeed, since several years now, several decades actually, there has been an increased emphasis on the use of standardized achievement tests, including at early ages, with the early grade reading assessments and so on, that a number of agencies promote. Undoubtedly, these achievement tests are more reliable in measuring learning, and they can more easily be compared over time. But they do have some disadvantages. Firstly, they are usually sample-based, certainly in bigger countries. In smaller nations, such as those of the OECS, this is less a problem. But the second problem is very much a problem. The coverage of the curriculum is limited. These achievement tests tend to focus on what are considered basic skills, reading, writing, arithmetic, and they are not always really representative of the overall coverage of the curriculum. And at times also, especially when these assessment or achievement tests are part of an international program, they are more inspired, influenced by the international agenda than by the national curriculum. So while examinations have their weaknesses, achievement tests may also have weaknesses. It is also correct that they can be quite expensive to administer. There are some data on that necessary we can share, which show that they become quite expensive. Now, examinations are not cheap either, but examinations are in any case being undertaken within any education system. They exist already, and there is no additional cost. While here, the achievement tests, they incur an additional cost. What is then the way forward? Well, I think that first of all, we need to avoid, of course, using unreliable examinations as a measurement of quality. In the Caribbean region, the situation is actually really quite good because the Caribbean Examinations Council is known for its expertise in this area and is indeed a very serious body that has built up a strong reputation and strong expertise. We also need to avoid, I think, referring only to achievement tests because the risk is that they limit too much our attention to the very broad message that any education system should transmit to the broader outcomes that we will refer to in a moment. The way forward, I think, is not to abandon examinations. Not examinations will remain in the system because they are a useful selection tool, a useful certification tool, but if we really focus on improving examinations, they can also become a useful measurement for learning, and we need to ensure that achievement tests also reflect a national curriculum. I think it is by combining the strength of both instruments, examinations and achievement tests, that we will get a more comprehensive, reliable and valid measurement of the quality of the results that our students obtain. Let us go now to the last domain that we want to examine, namely the domain of outcomes, and look at some indicators of outcomes. When we are talking about outcomes, we are talking about the long-term changes at individual, social and economic level to which education contributes. There are changes for the individual and changes for the nation. The seventh target of the Sustainable Development Goal, the fourth Sustainable Development Goal on education, offers a good summary of what are some of these long-term outcomes that ideally every education system contributes. It reads that the expectation is that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among other things, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and non-violence, global citizenship, appreciation of cultural diversity, culture's contribution to sustainable development. It is a very ambitious, very broad goal, reflecting a wide range of values, skills, domains of knowledge in the education system that students are expected to achieve. And in the way it is formulated, you can already imagine that this is not a simple objective to measure and not a simple domain to assess. The measurement of the achievement of this outcome is indeed very hard, and UNESCO has proposed, the UNESCO Institute of Statistics has proposed an indicator to assess the achievement of this particular target. I will read the indicator and then I will ask you a question. The indicator is the extent to which global citizenship education and education for sustainable development, including gender equality and human rights, so the extent to which these two domains of educational content are mainstreamed at all levels in A, national education policies, B, curricula, C, teacher education, and D, student assessment. So this is the indicator that is expected to assess, or that has been defined to assess the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goal, which says that all learners acquire the knowledge and the skills needed to promote sustainable development. And my question to you is, do you see a problem with this indicator? Look again at the Sustainable Development Goal 4.7 in the previous slide. Look again at this indicator and tell me if you feel that this indicator indeed assesses the achievement of that particular goal. You can pause the presentation for a moment to reflect on this question. So the question was, do you see a problem with this indicator? Yes, and indeed, because actually the indicator does not assess the actual achievement of the objective. The indicator does not tell us if students, learners, have actually acquired the knowledge and the skills needed to promote sustainable development. What the indicator does is it informs us about the intent of government to address these particular issues in policies, in the curricula, in teacher education, and student assessments. But it does not really inform us about the achievement, about what students actually have learned. And this is not in itself surprising, because it demonstrates the difficulty precisely to assess these skills. Examinations, achievement tests, they do test outputs in terms of results that students immediately acquire through the learning that they do. They test the way the curriculum has been transmitted, but on issues that are relatively easy to test: numeracy, literacy, maybe some science knowledge, some knowledge of history and geography and biology and so on. But the domain that is more related to outcomes, which is related to students' attitudes, related to students' mastery of domains as fuzzy, if that's the right term, as gender equality, human rights, culture of peace and non-violence, these are usually not assessed through examinations and tests. And therefore, it is very difficult indeed to measure them, and it is very difficult to include them into an analysis of the education system. And that is, it's a bit unfortunate, because in the same way as we have argued that processes may be more important than inputs, and they are more difficult to measure than inputs, in the same way it could be argued that these outcomes are more important than the results in terms of learning of literacy, numeracy, and basic skills. And again, we are in a similar situation. The outcomes are more difficult to assess and to analyze than the immediate results. One alternative is to examine the relationship between education and the world of work, and especially the impact of education on students' future employment, because indeed, one outcome of the education system is also that education will improve through ensuring a good relationship between what students learn and what they will need in the job market. That education will improve social mobility for the individual and socioeconomic development for the nation. And that we can do through an examination of the relationship between education and the world of work. And two questions that we should answer then are: to what extent do the numbers and the profiles of school leavers and graduates match the requirements of the economy, and in particular the human resource requirements of the economy? And also, does the education system prepare young people for self-employment? When examining these questions, we are examining actually what we tend to call the external effectiveness of the education system. These questions indeed refer to that particular aspect, external effectiveness of the education system. It is a very broad topic that we will not examine here in detail, but just give a few major points. Some useful indicators in this regard are, for instance, the percentage of graduates from a specific study field, graduates in engineering, for instance, who found relevant employment within 1 year after graduation. Relevant employment would then be an employment that is related indeed to the studies they have followed. Or percentage of graduates in the social and human sciences who have found some employment in that particular sector. It can of course also be into particular skills, percentage of graduates of electricity and plumbing who have found relevant employment within that particular section or that particular sector rather within 1 year of the graduation. Another useful indicator is to look at unemployment rates by level of education and field of study. These indicators, they help us understand in how far the education system actually provides students with the skills that are needed in the job market and prepares them for the job market. And we do know that in quite a number of countries, the phenomenon of unemployed university graduates is a very serious phenomenon that is threatening the social peace in the nation and threatening also the development of the nation, and at the same time is a very poor reflection of the relevance of our education system and a very sad reality for the youngsters and their parents who have invested in university studies and as only result find that they cannot find a job because these jobs do not exist or the skills they have learned are not sufficiently relevant. This is a very important topic. It goes beyond the question of quality. It's more focusing on issues of relevance and external effectiveness. In many cases, the data to construct these indicators are not always easily available, especially the first one, the percentage of graduates who found relevant employment within 1 year after graduation. It demands a very good labor market information system and tracer studies on students who have left secondary school, upper secondary university education, or technical and vocational education. And the interpretation of these indicators is not evident either. There is a broad discussion if the phenomenon of unemployed graduates is the result of the weakness of the education system or more a reflection of the poor development of the economy in a particular country, or an economic model that does not sufficiently put value on high-level skills. So interpretations there are not easy at all. It's an important domain. With that, we come to the final slide of our presentation. A few final points as a short summary. I recall, however, that we will also have on the 4th of September a synchronous session where we will discuss together the major points that came out of the 4 different topics that we are addressing. Quality is the first one. The capacity of the educational administration will be the second one. Equity and cost and financing will be the third and the fourth one. So we will still come back to this presentation. We will present then a summary and also enter in a bit more detail, but here are a few final points nevertheless. Firstly, quality is a multifaceted concept. We have been discussing so many different issues in this presentation. We have been discussing briefly, but nonetheless, the issue of pupil-teacher ratios, the issue of availability of computers, the issue of the values that the education system transmits, the issues of teacher qualifications, the issue of school management, and so on and so forth. So quality is a multifaceted concept because indeed many different factors, many different elements influence quality, and a single factor does not offer a comprehensive explanation for low or high quality, and therefore we cannot have an analysis that only analyzes a few of these elements. Usually, the necessary data are available for the factors that are not necessarily the most important, such as inputs, or the factors that are essential, but on which governments don't have an immediate impact, namely results. A government cannot change results immediately. You change results by improving the input and by improving the process and by improving student support, teacher support, and so on. The two factors that are really maybe that deserve a lot of attention, issues of processes, issues of outcomes, are the ones on which it is most difficult to find information, and therefore they are the most difficult to analyze. So we are in a somewhat paradoxical situation whereby when we examine and analyze quality, we tend to focus on elements that are undoubtedly important: inputs, availability, and quality of inputs and results. But we focus on them because we have a lot of information on them, while elements that are equally, if not more important, we may neglect them a little bit because the information on them is not that easy to construct and to analyze. Thank you for your attention to these two parts of this discussion. We look forward to our further working together in this module.